Welcome everyone to the second session in our series of three exploring the current and future world of work and the workplace. My name is Tim Allen and I lead on workplace strategy and change for Aberley. So, excuse me, firstly, just in case there may be someone who hasn't come across Aberley before, we're independent workplace consultants. And by that, we mean that we're focused on the right outcome for clients, having no ulterior motive on any further design project or transaction fee associated with an outcome. We've got decades of collective experience planning, delivering successful workplace strategy and change programs for tens of thousands of people across hundreds of clients through the UK, Europe, and the US. But enough about us, as they say. So amidst the current, and I guess quite literally today's, if any of you were listening to our conversation as we started off the webinar today, the current business and organizational uncertainty we're faced with, what we might call the ABC of disruption right now. We've got the American election, which we were just talking through, and the wider geopolitical polarizing and tensions that go with it. We have Brexit, and of course the coronavirus, where the daily statistics are continually a sober reminder of the very personal nature of the pandemic. This afternoon, though, we're hoping to shine a little light through the mists of the crystal ball to explore the real estate sector market in a little bit more detail. And in our first session, Claire Hammond from Blick Rothenberg provided a fascinating overview of the human aspect to change on the business transformation currently underway at Gazettes. And I'm sure that Claire's joining us again today for any further people-related queries alongside other panel members from our last session. So this afternoon we have an equally amazing panel of guest speakers who have a positive abundance of experience in the field of real estate. We have Richard Peperell and Lee Williamson from Spring 4, the independent real estate consultants and project managers. And we have Ramatu, Banga and Faye, Hyland from Fieldfisher, the European law firm. A little more detail on our panel, so only very briefly. Richard began his real estate career, I should be having a big red book at this point, shouldn't I? In 1991, before starting Spring 4 in 2001. A successful track record of creating, negotiating, implementing market-leading transactions across varied industry sectors and nationwide locations. Richard's joined by his colleague Lee. Lee's been a director of Spring 4 since 2015, experience in transactions through the UK and advised clients overseas in the US, Hong Kong, Singapore, Germany and others. Lee's appointed the chairman of the Tenant Representation Advisors Society in London, known as TRADS, not as I misread it initially, TARDIS, and he's an executive committee member for Exis Global. We also have Ramatu. Ramatu is a partner in the real estate firm Fieldfisher's London office. Ramatu has over 25 years experience of working with both private and public sector clients on a wide range of commercial and estate transactions, particularly for owners and operators of commercial property. Ramatu is also a member of the Women in Property and the Leisure Property Forum. And then finally, by no means leastly, we have Faye, who's a director in the real estate litigation team in Fieldfisher's London office, dealing with all types of contentious commercial property issues, including business lease renewals, dilapidations, assignment issues, tenant default arrears, and service charge disputes. So we're thoroughly delighted that we have these people joining us this afternoon. And that's our team of experts. But why are we particularly looking at the golden triangle as we might reference it right now? Well, the physical, virtual, human, or more specifically, the property, technology, and people side. Well, this is a moment in recent history like no other. We've had a lot of mention of that, but I mentioned the current business and organizational disruption just now. And if there's one thing that businesses and organizations truly hate, it's disruption and the seeming inability to be able to plan with any degree of certainty. Now, at Aberley, we believe that now is a good time for organisations to start preparing for the new world of work. You know, its arrival was accelerated this year as we've all experienced working away from the office, physically away from colleagues, and using technology, all to a degree somewhat unimagined at the start of the year. This in turn has shifted all of our hopes and expectations on the future of commuting, office presence, location autonomy, and overall personal choice. So now creates a misalignment of people and place, as it were. So when we do consider what all of this means for work and the workplace, we really do have to explore the wider perspective about people, culture, community, sustainability, technology, travel, the working environment, whether that's the office, home, or hybrid, and of course, real estate. All of this interconnected in a way that truly underpins how we and organizations in turn will perform. And this is the true nature of work and the workplace. So hence our great team of experts are here to provide some guidance across all of these areas. So to start the conversation on the real estate aspect of place, let's turn firstly to Lee, who's going to provide an overview of the real estate market right now, and perhaps even more helpfully, a view of what we should all be thinking about as we prepare for the future. So Lee, over to you.
Tim, thanks for the very comprehensive introduction. So Spring 4's focus is really the office market. So today for our presentation, that's really where the focus is going to be. So Miriam, if we just go to the next slide, essentially the way that we're going to do the presentation is there's sort of three sections. The first section is macro view of the UK office market, really just to set the scene. Then we'll talk a little bit about what current tenant trends we've been seeing in the markets, and then we'll sort of be looking after that towards the future. So if we start with this first slide of the macro view, I suppose when we look at UK office markets, I like to sort of think of it as a three-tier system, distinctively not to be mistaken with the COVID three-tier system in England. And when I think of this tiered system, I think of tier one as predominantly central London. And the reason for that is London is the largest office market in the UK, and it's also the most expensive by quite a margin. And when I say expensive, the way that we look at offices in the UK in terms of cost, there are predominantly three costs. There's the rent that the tenant pays to the landlord, business rates, which is essentially a commercial property tax, and service charges, which helps the maintenance and the running of a building. So when you're looking at central London, if you look at rents, for example, prime rents for really good quality office space is anywhere between 60 to 80 pounds per square foot per annum in most areas. And in fact, there are certain areas of central London that are even more expensive. St. James and Mayfair are two of those places. And only last month, despite all of the sort of bad news with COVID, there was actually a new world record rent set, which was at £250 per square foot, which is absolutely astronomical. When we look at tier two cities, that covers predominantly the large cities outside of London. So Manchester, Birmingham, Glasgow, and some others. And cost-wise, they'll approximately be about half the cost, or maybe a little bit less than central London. And then tier three is essentially everything else. And roughly speaking, that's probably about a third or less of the cost of central London. So that sort of gives context towards, I suppose, the main markets in the UK. If we just go to the next slide, I thought the next thing that would be useful is just sort of set the scene in terms of where we've been over the last few years and where we are currently. So you can sort of see a slightly crude graph that I've created. That starts at 2008 when we had the last major recession. That red line that you can kind of see going up and down on that graph is essentially, broadly speaking, what's happened to market rents across the country. Obviously, there's always exceptions, but broadly speaking, that's what we've seen across all three tiers of markets. So the recession happened, rents started to decline, they bottomed out in the middle of 2009. After that, they sort of gradually increased over a period of years. And as we got into 2015 and early 2016, there are new record rents being set all over the country in lots of different markets. And that really peaked right before the Brexit referendum result. And then obviously that happened. The immediate impact on most markets is that the, I suppose, growth that we were seeing just sort of stopped. Headline rents for offices basically stayed where they were. There was a little bit of movement in terms of landlords giving away a little bit more lease flexibility, and they're also giving away a little bit more what we like to call incentives, which is rent-free periods. So when you sign up to a lease, usually a tenant would receive a period of rent-free, and that sort of moved out a little bit. So since 2016, it's been fairly stagnant across, as I say, most markets, but not all. There are exceptions. And then obviously at the beginning of 2020, we went into lockdown because of COVID-19. And there's a sort of question mark on my graph because, to be honest, no one's really sure what's happening. when lockdown happened, I think the two things that we initially saw were that if tenants had office requirements, if they're at an advanced stage of acquiring a new lease, those deals either were postponed and just stopped, or they proceeded, but they proceeded with added flexibility in terms of when their lease might start, or they were obtaining larger levels of incentives. If there was an early office requirement, for the most part, those were just all postponed because of the uncertainty that COVID-19 had created. So since that lockdown had begun, there's not been a huge amount of transactional evidence across the markets to really show a sustained change, I suppose, in terms of what's happening with the markets. There are lots of anecdotal examples of particular buildings where there's a lot more flexibility in terms of what tenants are able to negotiate in terms of rents, but there's no consistent trend. I would say the other interesting thing to mention before we move on to the next slide, sorry, is just serviced offices. And the point that I wanted to make with that is, if you don't know what a serviced office is, by the way, it's essentially the two probably most well-known brands are WeWork and IWG, which has the Regis brand. And they're essentially operators that will take a lease in a building, chop up all the space into smaller units, and then basically license it out to lots of different tenants. And they make a premium by offering tenants lots of flexibility. So historically, you tended to find tenants wanting to have short-term occupation of offices. This was really popular with them. So serviced offices have grown massively over the last 5 years. WeWork came into the UK market in 2014, I think it was. And up until, I'd say, last year, they had acquired over 4 million square feet in London. So they're the largest occupier in the entire city. So serviced offices, for a variety of reasons, have just grown massively. But one thing that we've seen as a result of COVID-19 is a much more clear reaction in terms of pricing. And that's largely driven by the fact that, as I said before, one of the ways they make the premium when they sublet space to lots of tenants is by offering short-term flexible license agreements with tenants. So a lot of those tenants, because of COVID-19, were breaking those contracts. Serviced offices had a huge amount of vacancy coming up, and that's impacting them quite badly. So whereas traditional leased offices hasn't seen too much change in pricing, serviced offices absolutely have. So if we go to the next slide, we'll sort of move on to tenant trends, and the sort of two that Richard and I wanted to focus on for today. And the first one is flexibility. So one thing that we've seen, and this is something that's been happening well before COVID-19, is this trend towards tenants wanting to have more flexibility in terms of how they occupy their offices. So back in the 1990s, when Richard started his career, it was very common at that point in time. It was very common at that point in time for tenants to sign up to 25-year leases, for example. That's virtually unheard of today. So over the years, the sort of traditional lease term that a tenant would sign up to has got smaller and smaller and smaller. Obviously, there is a limit to how short a lease can be for a number of reasons. One good reason would be the capex that it costs for a tenant to go into a new office to fit out their space. So because of that, they don't necessarily want to have too short of a lease, but the trend has been definitely downwards. One thing we've also seen is just the prevalence of break options, tenant break options being incorporated into leases. And to be honest, I can't even remember the last time I agreed a lease that didn't have one. So that's something that we've seen a lot more of. COVID-19 again is allowing tenants to get a bit more leverage in their negotiations to get break options, maybe even in earlier stages of a lease where you may have not had that before. And also in terms of flexibility, again, this growth in serviced offices has created, it's really impacted the market quite substantially. And one of the outcomes of that is we've seen more and more tenants look to have not necessarily all, but a part of their portfolio, if they have lots of offices, in serviced offices. And that allows them to sort of flex in size when they need to without committing to longer term traditional leases. The other point on flexibility I wanted to make is a little bit technical, so I'll try and keep this as simple as possible. But it relates to what we know as the 1954 Landlord and Tenant Act. And what that essentially means is when you have a lease in the UK, you either have a lease that is protected by that legislation or not protected by that legislation. And if you have a lease that is protected by the Landlord and Tenant Act, you get a variety of benefits. But one of the really key ones, particularly now, is a statutory right to renew your lease. So what that essentially means is when your lease comes to an end, and every lease will have an expiry date, if you have a protected lease, you don't necessarily have to leave at the expiry date, and you can continue your occupation unless the landlord has certain grounds to oppose it, which can be quite difficult. And this is really, really important at the moment. We see lots and lots of tenants really taking advantage of it at the moment. So, for example, I have a law firm client who's based in the City of London. They were adamant that they wanted to relocate to a new building for expansion purposes. We were looking at lots of different options. In the end, we signed up to a new building, or we'd agreed heads of terms to sign up to a new building. And at quite a late stage, they actually decided they didn't want to do it. So we aborted the transaction. We aborted the transaction in October 2019, and their lease was going to expire in January 2020, so 4 months away. If that lease wasn't protected, they would have been in a really, really difficult position, and negotiating against the landlord in a situation like that would have been very, very difficult. But because they had this protection, it allowed them and us to have a proper negotiation with the landlord. And one of the other benefits of Landlord and Tenant Act is you're basically guaranteed to pay a market rent. So you can't really be leveraged against the landlord too much. So, you know, a key piece of advice, if you can get a lease that's protected, you should absolutely try and get one.
It's also the net effective rent, isn't it? So it's the rent that you don't often see as a tenant day one, because you always see an inflated rent subject to those incentives that you talk about.
That's right. Miriam, if we just go to the next slide, the next point in terms of tenant trends, this was an image that Richard found last week that we thought was quite prudent.
And sort of rinsing out the corporate office, which I thought had quite a lot of parallels to what's happening.
And I suppose the key message here in terms of what we've seen in the markets is there is this trend of tenants rationalising their offices. And this can apply to tenants that have a single office or tenants that have multiple offices across the UK. And essentially what we're seeing and have been seeing is tenants just getting leaner. And there's a few reasons for that. One reason is, you know, it goes back to the first slide, is cost. You know, offices are incredibly expensive in the UK. If not the most expensive in the world, if you look at, you know, St James and Mayfair in the West End of London. So because of that, you know, a lot of occupiers have to think very carefully about how much space they're taking and committing to for long periods of time. The other reason tenants are getting leaner these days as well is just because of the flexible ways of working, the different options available to tenants because of technology and a number of other things. And what we've seen is the pandemic has really just accelerated that trend. So, you know, I think for a lot of businesses, it's legitimized the fact that in many ways, you know, working from home and creating flexible working practices is actually very feasible. And the other thing we've seen, you know, that's led to this rationalization is for certain sectors, there's a huge amount of M&A activity. So if you look at the insurance sector as an example, they're constantly buying other brokerages and companies, and by doing that, they're inheriting these large historic estates. So there are lots of tenants at the moment as well who just have big portfolios. They're getting bigger and bigger, and they're desperately trying to rationalize them, create hubs, and find solutions where they can get more people under a single roof. So if we go to the next slide, we'll now move on to the future. So what do we expect to happen going forwards? So this first slide is of, we've got an image of a rather bleak looking empty office with a lonely desk. There's been a lot of stuff in the press.
Sorry, I'm just going to make a comment here and say that obviously that's none of the offices that we'd ever be involved with, just to point out.
There's been a lot of stuff in the press about, you know, is it the end of offices, you know, with people working from home so much because of the pandemic? You know, is this the death? And if we go to the next slide, I think, you know, our view is certainly that it isn't. I think that one thing that we would expect to see, and again, this goes back to this trend of tenants rationalizing their estates and offices, which is that what could be a likely outcome is that tenants will just be taking less space, but better space. So if you're looking at really good quality office buildings in central London, for example, we think, you know, new skyscrapers, tower buildings, I think those will have a huge amount of demand going forwards because tenants want to create, on the whole, you know, attractive places to come in. So when you have offices who are coming in, even if it's 2 days a week or 3 days a week, they're coming into an interesting place, something that has lots of amenities and collaborative spaces. And it's very different to the sort of one person, one desk model that has existed for a long period of time. Richard, were you about to add something there?
Only to accentuate that, the sense of place, and something which, we're starting to hear, which is, absence makes the heart grow fonder. There's a lot of people who haven't been back to their office, and actually they're getting quite excited about that possibility. And when that occurs, there's going to be, some expectation. So we think the corporate really needs to address some of the issues that they've potentially historically had as to what their office space has been providing.
I think that may depend slightly on the office. Richard, I have to say some of the offices I've seen may not be enticing people back too quickly. Certainly the images that you're showing there are great spaces for people, but I appreciate that what we're saying, of course, is that the lens people currently have is that mandated working from home for such a long period of time does have an impact.
Appreciate, but I think the expectation is that when people get back, I think there will be some high expectations of what that is. And I think the corporate can now start to, and should start to think about that now. I think also on flexibility, Lee, I mean, we're going to touch on some other issues that were not necessarily about the physical aspect of it, but more about, some of the other aspects that we've got landlords who are providing services to buildings. And I think one of the things that we've seen with tenants making decisions to go into buildings is that they've ended up expecting those levels of service to be provided, but ultimately they've found that those operators have failed, and that those business centres, cafes, roof terraces, all of which were an attractive part of going to a building, have suddenly not been available to them. So I think one of the things that people have also sort of ended up relying on is you can only rely on yourself. Who's your counterparty in the provision of this? That counterparty relationship's got some questions on it.
Yeah, absolutely. And then just finishing off this slide as well, I think one of the things that we're expecting to see is obviously with tenants rationalising, taking less space but better space, there are a few outcomes that could come out of that. So one could be potentially lower grade specification offices coming back to the market in potentially quite large numbers. So if you have tenants that are consolidating a number of offices, say in London, into a single building that's, overall net less space, there could be a lot of what we like to call grade B or below stock that comes back to the market. So that could be a challenge going forwards. And then just on that point on serviced offices that I made earlier, because they're struggling quite a lot at the moment with vacancy rates, there is potential for certain operators to maybe go under over the next couple of years. And that one of the results of that could be, again, an influx of more space coming to the market. So it will be an interesting few years ahead, that's for sure. Marion, if we just go to the next slide. This is a picture of a spring floor letting board on a building of one of our tenants. And I think the point that we're making here is one other trend that we're seeing. And again, this goes back to the rationalization point. As tenants try and consolidate offices, get leaner, get smaller, one of the results is, inevitably there are offices that they may still have a lease of that they need to dispose of. So one thing that we're seeing quite a lot of at the moment and over the last 6 months is a huge influx of tenant space coming to the markets. And one thing as a tenant, to really look out for is just how you differentiate yourself in the current market, because it's, the lettings market is quite challenging at the moment. If there are more and more landlord spaces coming back to the market, potentially serviced office space coming to the market, there's a lot of competition out there. So if you're a tenant trying to sublet space, you really have to think quite carefully about how you position yourself to appropriately compete with those other competitors. If we go to the next slide, this is quite a funny image of a well-known UK TV show. And this sort of centers around this concept of offices as service, which Richard touched on. And, one of the things that I've always thought about is, if you look at a traditional office tenant, they can be paying a huge amount of rent to a landlord, tens, hundreds of thousands of pounds, even millions of pounds a year. And if you compare it to most other areas of, society and world we live in, there are these situations where, if you go to a hotel, if you go to a restaurant, you expect a certain level of hospitality and service. And for some reason, historically, that's never really existed between tenants and landlords in office leasing contracts. We've seen instances over the last 5 years where this looks like it may be beginning to change. Obviously, this influx of service offices has created more of a hospitality environment in those business centres. Traditional landlords have had to react to that in many ways. So if you look at 22 Bishopsgate, which is a brand new development in the City of London, which is over 1 million square feet, that's a development by AXA, and they're incorporating all of these, or they're proposing to incorporate all these very interesting amenity spaces. So climbing walls, gyms, breakout areas, shared meeting room facilities, and that could be really attractive to a lot of tenants. But I think, as Richard says, there is this concept of, landlords possibly wanting to change, promising something, but not quite delivering it. And we have had experiences of that. And I think there was one particular example also in London where there was a building that was developed in about 5 years ago. Won't name which one. But they were marketing this building with a whole floor that was supposed to be an amenity floor for the tenants. And that was going to be landlord operated and paid through the service charge. And tenants signed up to the building. When they moved in, the landlord then basically got a third-party operator to run that floor. That third-party operator has now gone bust. And now this amazing amenity space everyone was promised is just a vacant, empty floor in the building. So I think there is a little bit of a way to go, but I think as a sort of general trend, I think we will be seeing offices hopefully move towards more of a service model. If we go to the next...
Lee, there's just one other point on that, which was that offices as a service, coming back to tenant disposals, what we're seeing is tenants with surplus space having to face the reality that, yes, they'd like to dispose of their space, but tenants are demanding more from that. Now, often that can be Cat B space, the concept of plug and play, the concept of full service being provided by a tenant to their subtenant. And we can see a lot of that, and there's growth in that area, and that competes and potentially outcompetes landlord Cat A space.
Yeah, good point, Richard. Thanks. Miriam, if we just go back to the next slide. So another trend is simplification. So one thing that we see virtually every tenant say is, why is it so complicated? Why are leases so complicated? And the number of times I've tried to explain what a hypothetical landlord and a hypothetical tenant is to a client who's based in America for the purposes of an open market rent review, and I just get a puzzled look back. It's countless. And even trying to explain it to someone in the UK is virtually impossible. So I'm always asked by tenants, why is it so complicated? If you compare it to a service office license agreement, which is a couple of pages, a lease can be 100 pages or more. I'm not saying it should go down to a couple of pages, but I think there probably is somewhere in the middle that could make more sense. The other thing with simplification, the point that I wanted to make was, tenants moving into offices. One thing that we've seen that's been an issue constantly is just IT connectivity. So, it's one of these things that, I think most people these days view it almost like a utility, as if it was electricity. So the fact that we've got clients who want to acquire a lease in a building but can't get IT connectivity for 3 to 6 months just isn't acceptable. So I think, going forwards, there will be a move towards simplifying the office market in a number of different ways. And it'll be interesting to see how that happens. And then if we move to the last slide in terms of future trends, again, this is a slightly crude graph that I put together. But this is basically just a graph that shows essentially the cyclical nature of office rents in the UK. And they tend to sort of go up and down, and I suppose over a long period of time, broadly are sort of going up. And Marion, if you click your button, something should appear on the slide. There we go. So this is where we sort of see UK offices at the moment. If we think back to that first slide, that sort of trough at the bottom, at the sort of bottom left-hand corner of the graph where it's at the bottom, that was essentially mid-2009. UK offices, again, as a whole, have been increasing in terms of where rental levels are. We think we've just gone past the peak of it. There's anecdotal evidence that rents are dropping at particular buildings in certain markets. And we think on a general basis, UK office market rents will probably go down. The question is by how much, and a lot of that is just dependent on what happens with the pandemic, with all the uncertainty. Miriam, if you click again, service offices has popped up, and obviously that goes back to my point, which was that I think price sensitivity of service offices, because of their short-term nature, means that they've had to react to the pandemic a bit quicker than UK offices on the whole. So we see them being a little bit further along the cycle in terms of where they are with pricing. And anecdotally, we've been doing a number of service office deals, and the rates that we've been quoted are across the board 30% lower than where they were pre-COVID in a lot of instances. And then, Miriam, if you click again, I think the final point we wanted to make on this slide is that, although we're talking about UK offices on the whole, there are absolutely exceptions. The UK is a complicated general market. There's lots and lots of different sub-markets, and there are lots of places that are behaving slightly differently. And if you look at Cambridge and Oxford as an example, with a big pharmaceutical presence there, rents there are, and we expect will continue to actually keep growing. So we don't think they've necessarily reached their peak yet. So that's an example of two locations in the UK that are behaving differently from the sort of general average. So I think that gets to the end of our presentation for now. Over to you.
Lovely, thanks, Liam. I should an awful lot of information within that one. I was just interested in a few elements that came out of that one. Actually, the IT connectivity. I'm with you. That's going to have to be something seen as an inherent part of it. And for heaven's sake, I look at making sure that Wi-Fi is included on any packages going to stay at hotels when you used to go and stay at hotels. So I think the sense that we can potentially manage without IT is just not going to be there when you're looking at spaces. So that's definitely one aspect of it. I do like the idea of rinsing out the office. That's intriguing. So that's a fun one to be thinking about. You mentioned good quality in terms of real estate. What does good quality look like?
I think there's probably, Richard, feel free to jump in, but I think there's a few different things at play. I think one is location. So, for certain tenants, quality is location. So if you're an insurance company based in London, there's a natural gravitation towards the EC3 postcode in the City of London to be near Lloyd's of London, which is the insurance market. So, for those types of businesses, they absolutely need to be geographically close to a certain area. When we talk about grade A space, grade A specification space, that usually means a new building or something that's been comprehensively refurbished. So something where, you've got a brand new office floor, you've got new raised floors, you've got, a modern air conditioning system, a new one, lots of glass windows, not too dark, central core, hopefully. There's lots and lots of different things. Every tenant looks for different things.
That's fine.
And Tim, I would add the point on counterparty. So, I think about quality buildings in terms of who owns it, who manages it, and who's your relationship with.
Yeah, it's all very useful points, and that's partly what we're trying to bring up in the session today, for people to be able to take away some of those good points, thinking, what does good look like, above and beyond, of course, what may be appropriate for them as an organisation in terms of location and good. And I think, as others have said before, older buildings with small lifts maybe are not going to be at the top of people's lists so much anymore. I'm intrigued also by the flexibility, so that you're both mentioning around shorter lease periods. What's the sort of shortest that you've seen people asking for? Obviously, it's come down from the 25 years since people like Richard and I came into the business. But what are we looking at now?
I think partially it's a function of how much space the tenant's taking or committing to. So, if you're a tenant that's looking to commit to 10,000 square feet or more, I think when you're at that sort of scale, you're obviously spending quite a significant sum of money on the fit out usually. So, tenants, in that bracket and above, we're probably looking at a minimum 10-year commitment. But as we said before, it's very likely to have a break option probably at year 5. Once you get below 10,000 square feet, you tend to find shorter leases. So, it's quite common to find 5-year leases, maybe leases with a 3rd-year break. But then, you will have tenants with specific requirements. So if you're a tenant that's growing quite quickly and you're not too sure where you're going to be in headcount on sort of short-term horizon, if you're not interested in the service office model, you can look at tenant release space in the traditional lease market. And it's very common in that area for tenants to commit to terms as low as 12 months, which we've seen.
Okay. Oh, sorry, Richard. Yeah.
Only to add to that, we talk in terminology such as a 10 by 5, that means a 5-year break, or, we've got things like 8 by 5 by 3, and you can see the flexibility where you've got an 8-year commitment with a break at 3 and 5. And then when you flip to L&T, Landlord and Tenant Act, and you get to the protection, and you get to the end of that lease, we've asked for 12 months on 20,000 square feet. We've asked for 2 years on 10,000 square feet. We've asked for nothing and played an L&T game and managed to serve notice after 6 months of holding over and left. So that's just another aspect of this flexibility, playing back to L&T and obviously our presentation to come.
Indeed. And look, thanks for that. So one final question for the two of you, really, and bearing in mind it's just us here on the call, so we can be completely candid over it. Obviously, part of the raison d'etre for Aberley is that we're always keen to capture the essence of what an organisation really needs in terms of spatially and culturally to improve performance of the business and people. And therefore, that requires a good understanding of how much space an organisation actually needs to undertake the activities. Do you still get clients coming to you with a lease break coming up with a sense of, well, we've currently got X square foot, so we'll just have X plus square foot just between us? Does that still happen?
Yes. I think it does.
Okay, well, that was quick then.
I think you said X plus.
Yeah.
I think
Maybe
in
X
reality,
a bit now, but
well, that's right. I mean, I think in reality, people, and what we've seen is that people are much better informed about the way in which they use and occupy offices. Go back 10 years ago, people know what they're enjoying and how they're using it. They're better informed. They've taken down the offices. They've gone to open plan largely. They're in a very different space to they were 10 years ago. I think the big question is the COVID question, and what do they think they'll need going forward?
Indeed, yes, the hybrid office, which if we had several hours, but maybe that's another session to come on the hybrid office one. Look, that's super. Thanks both very much for taking us through a little bit of detail there around the current and future view from transactions from your perspective. Okay, so now let's turn to the arm of the law, dare we say it, as if we're to understand where the legal obligations and indeed opportunities lie with Ramatu and Faye. So Ramatu, I think you're starting us off here, so over to you.
Thanks, Tim. Yes, so Faye and I are going to take you through the current position on landlord and tenant law. We'll also talk a little about the types of discussions we've been having with our clients, and that's on both the tenant occupier side and the landlord side. And we'll tell you about the type of arrangements we've been assisting with putting in place over the last few months. So Faye, would you like to kick off?
Thanks, Ramatu. If we could just jump ahead a couple of slides, great, thank you. I was intending to begin by providing a brief run through of how the legislative landscape has changed over the last 9 months and the impact of those changes on landlords and tenants. The first of those changes was the Coronavirus Act, which came into force on the 25th of March, and that provided the legal basis for the lockdown of people and businesses, but it also did a great deal more besides, including in relation to commercial leases. The Corporate Insolvency Governance Act, or CIGA as it's known, came into force on the 26th of June, and that made significant changes to UK insolvency law. The Cabinet Office guidance followed on the 7th of May, and that was a precursor to the Government Code of Practice, which was published on the 19th of June. Both the guidance and the code are designed to encourage parties to work together to protect viable businesses. Next slide, please. Contrary to some initial misunderstanding, none of the legislation or guidance actually waives or defers a tenant's obligation to pay rent. However, what they do in combination is place significant restraints on a landlord's ability to recover outstanding rents from a tenant until the 31st of December. And in the case of the code, it sets out principles of behaviour and responses to difficulties experienced by both landlords and tenants as a result of coronavirus. If I could have the next slide, please. So the code applies to all commercial tenancies across the UK. It's voluntary, so not therefore legally enforceable, but it has been endorsed by various leading landlord and tenant organisations, and it's intended to apply until June next year. The key messages of the code are that landlords and tenants should work together collaboratively and behave responsibly and fairly. This means that tenants who can pay their rent should do so, and landlords are obliged to provide support where it's reasonably possible, and obviously having regard to their own financial commitments. Both parties are meant to behave transparently. So on the tenant side, that would involve the provision of financial information about their business to support a request for a concession. And on the landlord side, this would mean, for example, providing its reasons as to why a concession was refused. The code provides a selection of options for new rental payment arrangements for landlords and tenants to discuss, including rent-free periods or rent payment changes. However, they are just suggestions, so landlords and tenants are free to make their own arrangements. If I could have the next slide, please. So where does that leave landlords? Before the pandemic, a commercial landlord would have a whole menu of options that it could rely on for recovering arrears of rent. However, the new legislation has placed significant restrictions on those remedies. So I'm just going to spend the next couple of minutes explaining the options which remain available and what restrictions have been imposed by the legislation. Commercial rent arrears recovery, or CRAR, is the process which allows a landlord of commercial premises to recover rent arrears by taking control of tenants' goods at their premises, and if the arrears are not paid, then selling those goods. Before the new legislation, a landlord would need just 7 days worth of rent outstanding before CRAR could be exercised. However, that amount has now been increased to 276 days rent until the 24th of December, and then 366 days rent until the 31st of December. A landlord will also need to think about whether the tenant has goods in the premises worth seizing and whether they can actually access the premises during enforced lockdown periods. Landlords can still issue court proceedings against a tenant to recover rent or other sums due under a lease. However, this isn't a quick fix given the current backlogs at the court, and it's of limited assistance if the tenant is already in financial difficulty, so wouldn't have the means available to meet a judgment debt. Rent deposits. A rent deposit is a sum of money provided by a tenant to its landlord as security for payment of the rent due under a lease. The deposit will be accessible by the landlord in certain circumstances, such as non-payment of rent, with a requirement on the tenant to then top the deposit back up. In the current climate, however, there may be a concern about a tenant's ability to top the deposit up after a drawdown. So that being the case, many landlords may actually prefer to preserve the rent deposit for as long as possible and consider their other options. A landlord may be able to recover rent arrears from a third party, such as a former tenant or a former tenant's guarantor, an existing guarantor under a lease, or even a subtenant, being any tenant below the immediate tenant. Whether this is possible or even worth pursuing will depend on the terms of the lease and the solvency of that third party. In the case of subtenants, a landlord can serve a statutory notice, which is known as a Section 81 notice, and that will require the subtenant to pay the tenant's outstanding rent directly to the landlord. However, a Section 81 notice can only be served where a landlord would be able to exercise CRA against its immediate tenant, meaning 276 days worth of rent or more needs to be outstanding at the moment. If I could have the next slide, please. In terms of what landlords can no longer do until the 31st of December, forfeiture is a landlord's right to terminate a lease during the term. The Coronavirus Act has imposed a suspension on the forfeiture of business tenancies on the grounds of non-payment of rent. A landlord can, however, still forfeit for other breaches of the lease which don't relate to rent. SEGA has introduced 2 temporary restrictions on winding up petitions which are relevant to landlords. Firstly, a landlord cannot present a winding up petition relying on a statutory demand served before the 31st of December. And then secondly, until the 31st of December, a winding up petition cannot be brought based on a company's inability to pay its debts, unless the landlord can evidence that coronavirus has not had a financial effect on the tenant company, or the tenant company would have been unable to pay its debts regardless of the coronavirus impact. And finally, SEGA also introduced a new freestanding moratorium for companies, which is overseen by a professional insolvency monitor, and that applies for a 20 business day period, although that period can be extended. Once the moratorium is in place, enforcement or legal proceedings can only be brought with a court's permission. So what this means is landlord remedies such as forfeiture, CRA, debt recovery or insolvency proceedings would all be restricted. The moratorium gives companies a payment holiday from pre-moratorium debts, including rent. It does, however, have to pay rent during the moratorium period, which rent would accrue on a daily basis. So other than the moratorium, which is a permanent change, the restrictions that I've referred to are in place until the 31st of December. However, we do have to wait and see whether they are extended beyond that date. Having been extended twice already and given the current lockdown, it's not beyond the realms of possibility. And I'm now going to hand over to Ramatu.
Thanks, Faye. Okay, so arguments being run by tenants. Throughout March and April in particular, we received lots of calls from tenants, especially those in the retail and leisure sectors, but also office occupiers, particularly those who'd recently signed contracts or completed new leases for 5, 10, 15 years. Basically, they were hopeful that there'd be something in their contracts or leases or some legal argument which would help them either walk away or at least limit their rent and service charge liabilities. We studied the terms of their leases and considered legal concepts to see if there was anything that could help tenants. There was talk in articles about the principle of force majeure. Now, this is a well-known principle and is often used in agreements for lease and sell and purchase contracts, especially where development and building contracts are involved. But it isn't a concept that's routinely found in leases in England and Wales, so it doesn't help tenants in these circumstances. The closest thing we have to force majeure in leases, so circumstances beyond the tenant's reasonable control, are clauses around insured and uninsured risks, which allow for rent suspension in certain circumstances. Unfortunately, these clauses don't generally help tenants either in the current case, as the drafting is commonly linked to physical damage or a physical issue with the accessibility or use of premises. Although some clever property litigation lawyers, I might look at Faye here, may be trying to test that. Derogation from grant and breach of quiet enjoyment. These legal principles cover situations in which a landlord does something which effectively stops or severely restricts the tenant from being able to use and enjoy premises for the use permitted under the lease. The problem here is that it's not landlords who are locking the doors or saying to tenants, you can't come in, you have to work from home. It's the government who are giving guidance and at times like now, mandating these things. So again, these arguments don't help tenants in the current case. And the last common argument that we've seen is frustration. Now, this is my favourite legal argument. I think we've all felt frustration in the common sense at some time over the last few months. But considering frustration in a legal sense, it is potentially helpful to tenants, as it basically applies to situations where something unexpected happens, which isn't due to the fault or action of either party, which is fundamental, and which makes performance of a lease impossible or radically different. So in the present case, a tenant being unable to occupy property for. Now, frustration was actually argued unsuccessfully in a court in Hong Kong in similar circumstances during the 2003 SARS epidemic. That case involved a lease for 2 years, with only 11 months remaining at the time of the outbreak. The tenant was prevented from occupying as a result of government restrictions for 10 days, so a relatively short period. And it was held that the lease was not frustrated. So the lease continued and rent was still primarily payable. Now, we've obviously here had a longer period of mandated work from home already. Although for much of the last few months, working from home has been recommended for some as opposed to being mandated. But the point is still that where you have a lease of several years, is it really fundamentally incapable of being performed through such relatively short periods of government-required work from home or closure? This hasn't yet been tested in the courts here in relation to COVID, but it's anticipated that our courts would find in the same way as in the SARS case. It's one worth watching though, as clearly the longer this goes on, it may become a stronger argument. But for now, as many of you will have found from first-hand experience, it's difficult to find strong legal arguments for tenants to unpick leases or lawfully refuse to pay rent. Next slide, please, Marion. So, what are landlords and tenants doing in practice? We've been very busy in what are obviously really difficult circumstances for both landlords and tenants, and clearly I don't disregard the difficulties which many individuals are facing in society in general. We act for both landlords and tenants across a variety of sectors. I've heard some landlords express concern that some tenants are not really experiencing financial difficulties, yet still want rent concessions. And equally, I've heard some tenants express concern that some landlords are being heavy-handed and are ignoring obvious and genuine issues. I'm sure there's some truth in both statements, but our experience is that some landlords have in fact taken a very hard line, refused to engage in meaningful dialogue with tenants until rent deposits have been exhausted, whilst others have been engaging, doing deals, and in some cases sharing the pain. Landlord clients have come to us for advice on how to obtain rent payments, regain possession, or at least reserve their rights overall whilst making rent concessions in the short term. And for tenants, as I've already mentioned, we've been asked to advise on whether they can get out of agreements for lease and leases and what rights landlords have against them. Our advice to tenant clients who are struggling has been to communicate with landlords and not bury their heads in the sand if they're encountering difficulties, because sooner or later, the current restrictions which are preventing landlords from issuing winding up petitions and seeking possession will end. And with my tenant-friendly hat on, I do think that landlords need to consider what they will recover in practice if tenants ultimately become insolvent, and where they'll find new tenants willing to pay the same level of rents when they can again forfeit leases. Now, the types of arrangements and deals that we've been documenting over the last few months include simple changes from quarterly to monthly rent, temporary rent reductions, for retail and leisure premises, a move from an open market rent to a turnover rent, and in a few cases, a total rent holiday for a short period. Most organisations seem to be taking a pragmatic view. If a reduction is being made now, it's often on the basis that there will be some form of payback later down the line, either by rent top-up or an addition to the lease term. One of the issues, of course, is that we don't know how long the current disruption will last, so although a deal can be done now, it may yet need to be revisited in the months to come. One thing I would flag is please beware of the type of changes you agree to in a lease and how you document those changes. Sometimes a simple side letter is fine, and at other times formal deed of variation is more appropriate. Some changes can, though, give rise to unintended consequences, including a landlord losing the benefit of a guarantor or a tenant gaining security of tenure. And that was something that Lee and Richard talked about earlier with reference to the Landlord and Tenant Act 1954. Please, therefore, consider changes carefully, and if in doubt, please check before proceeding. Next slide, please, Marion. Thanks. So my last slide just covers a few thoughts on the possible effects of the last few months on leases going forward. Now, some of these have been touched on already by Lee and Richard, so I will scoot through. The first obvious effect is on the term of leases. I suspect tenants will be nervous of longer term commitments, and if they do enter into them, are likely to want more breaks. The next impact will no doubt be on rent. Depending on the sector, how the rent is structured, also rent suspension or reduction in circumstances which would include pandemics. Fit out. Perhaps a reduction in the cost that tenants are prepared to invest in new premises going forward, particularly if leases are for shorter periods. Bear in mind that the issue with flexibility is that although it's great in some respects, it does generally come at a cost, so perhaps a higher rent or a break penalty. One point to mention is that if you're one of the many tenants who must be considering your future property requirements, make sure you allow enough time to plan properly. And depending on the size of your organisation, this could be at least 12 or even 24 months. I'm sure most have done this already, but check your leases for break clauses and expiry dates, and consider the true costs of moving carefully. And the final thing I would say is that from a real estate perspective, we really are in very interesting times, given not only the effect of the pandemic, but over the next few months and years, the effect of Brexit and how we end up with that. Thank you. Back to Tim.
Super. Thanks, Ramatu and Faye, for a great overview summary, very clear, and hopefully very useful to people as they're starting to think through, well, what do I need to be bearing in mind right now? Some, not surprisingly, some interesting overlaps with Richard and Lee, which is great, simply on that sense of what's happening with leases and duration, which is interesting. Planning properly, one of the notes that I took out from that, we would tend to agree completely that it may feel that if you've got a year or two left to go on any leases, that actually you can just wait, but so much better to plan in advance and know specifically what you're after when you reach that point. So I think that's one aspect of it. I do love the idea of legal frustration. So that's one to watch out for in the future, I think, definitely. And the sense of, what can landlords be doing? Because there's been a lot of conversation generally within the sort of the workplace arena around where employers have been shall we say, more generous with what they've been allowing or encouraging employees to do in terms of working from home when it's not been mandated, but a sense of, keeping in touch, the sort of provision of furniture, just a general sense of enabling the wider well-being of their staff through this really difficult time. That it's interesting that if we see landlords in a similar light, and it was being said at one point that, there may be a recession, of course, that comes on the back of this, and therefore post-recession staff would think clearly around employers and where they may want to be engaged in the future based on the way that their employees have acted within this particular experience. I wonder whether we'll see something similar with landlords maybe. So landlords who have, shall we say, reacted quote unquote well, may be perceived as a better bet than landlords who haven't. I don't know, is that something that you think may be happening?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really interesting point. And it's one in which I think Lee and Richard may want to chip in, because I think this it kind of comes back to that point on quality. And so the quality of the offices, but also the quality of the relationships between the parties. I mean, I do have, I tend to act mainly for tenant clients, so occupiers, but actually I do have an awful lot of sympathy for landlords, because there are all sorts of different landlords in the market. And, frankly, they have bills to pay, and they have, debt on buildings and that sort of thing as well. So a lot of the focus has been on the tenants and the occupiers, and particularly in certain sectors, so leisure and retail. But actually, I think a lot of landlords will be saying, well, hang on, who's helping us? And, banks are not necessarily being very helpful. But I have certainly heard some tenants, particularly on the, I'd say in retail sector, where they have quite large property portfolios, they do anticipate that they will survive, and they have made comments about feeling or favouring certain landlords in the future, where they feel that they've been able to have a dialogue, there's been some understanding, and that they have more of a collaborative relationship in terms of thinking, well, we're going to get through this, we want to get through it, so that we will be able to pay the larger rents, etc., and share our profits with turnover rents in the future. So I think it's a very good point.
So repercussions to come if we behaved inappropriately through this time, I think, is one of the elements that are coming through from that. Oh, sorry, who's that?
So, yeah, I was just going to add to Ramatu's comments there, just to say that we're seeing the landlords become more visible, be more communicative, come and talk to their tenants. And often and historically, the role of the managing agent hasn't been the best conduit through which the relationship between the landlord and tenant has existed well. So actually we're starting to see the real asset owner appear and be far more interested in the relationship.
Well, good to hear. And I guess it also took me back to another point, only very briefly, because I'm going to start wrapping up this section right now. But I was intrigued on the mention for the code of practice, where the key message is that parties should behave responsibly and fairly. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed that that is actually the case. But I'm sure some more will come on that a little bit later on. Okay, acutely aware of our time. Probably time that we moved on from our conversations. I could have had a chat about this for an awful lot longer, but there we go. And I'm sure that we've got some questions that have been piling up through the presentation. So Rob, as our master of questions, what sort of topics and queries have we seen being raised?
Yeah, thanks, Tim. We've had some really interesting ones come through, actually, and we may not get a chance to get through all of these, but if not, we'll finish them offline and publish them via social media in some way or another. But just grouping some together, I think one of the first questions that has come up quite a bit is from the landlord perspective. I think you were just carrying on the conversation there. A couple of lines of inquiry, one of which is, will landlords become more sympathetic to changing leases so that tenants can sublet? And then a follow-up question, if you will, is that do we think landlords will have an appetite to start to upgrade their spaces in a falling rent market?
Interesting. Well, should we direct that one to Richard and Lee initially, just in the sense of what they think they see coming right now, and then we can perhaps get a quick view from Ramatu and Faye on perhaps the legal aspect to it. So, Richard and Lee, what are your thoughts? What are landlords currently doing to try and respond to that?
I think they've got challenges in respect of the quality of their space and how they compete. We've seen a lot of them going down what I'd call Cat A plus, some carpets, the odd bit of furniture, no real cabling. It's dressing to show. It doesn't really do much in terms of the tenant decision, but it has looked quite interesting from the tenant's perspective, though they've got to do much more beyond that. I think the landlord's biggest challenge is he needs to go all the way, and which of these traditional landlords is going to provide a proper office as a service to a tenant. We've got numerous negotiations where Cat B is being priced into the rent delivered by the landlord, and that's much more than we've seen in the past.
Yeah, just to answer that, I mean, in terms of what are landlords doing to their spaces to make it as attractive as possible to tenants, I can think of a number of buildings in the City of London, one tower building in particular, where the floor plates aren't huge. So I think it only works to a certain size bracket. But if you're below sort of 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 square feet in terms of floor plate, we're seeing lots and lots of landlords proactively fit those spaces out with furniture, partitions, kitchens, on the assumption that it just attracts tenants, particularly at the moment, because they don't have to spend any capex moving in. It doesn't quite work so well when you get into bigger floor plates, because I think the way that you configure those floors becomes a little bit more variable depending on the tenant, and obviously it's a much bigger investment.
I was just asked, are you seeing? So I know that one of the, without naming any names, one of the recent completions saw an interior climbing wall as part of the, shall we say, the spaces of service. Are you seeing that those kind of facilities and services are being demanded by occupiers?
Well, I think they certainly have been, and I think part of it has been a response to this huge growth in serviced offices that we've seen. So, typically when you go into a serviced office, you have a much smaller dedicated area than you would in a leased office, but you benefit from all this amenity space, so big kitchens, breakout areas, and other things. And I think, particularly in that smaller size of the market, I think a lot of landlords really had to try and start competing with serviced offices because they're competing over the same size tenant.
Yeah, sure. Oh, sorry, I was going to say actually, Ramatu and Faye, just before we move on, is there anything that you'd like to add from the landlord perspective, from the legal side?
Yes, I mean, I just wanted to quickly add, just on that point on subletting, absolutely on alienation. I do think that if landlords want tenants to take, a fair amount of space going forward, they're going to have to accept that the tenant is going to have a bit more flexibility. So both in terms of sharing, but particularly on subletting. So I do think that's a sensible thing for them to do.
And one thing that Richard and I have been quite keen on trying to introduce into as many leases as possible is, the traditional alienation rights that you might expect would be subletting your lease, assigning your lease, maybe sharing. But Richard's a very big fan of trying to incorporate flexibility where you can license space in your offices, which just adds a huge amount more flexibility in terms of allowing you to bring in smaller occupiers to share space with you.
So what we do there, Tim, is we take the group sharing clause of leases and we extend it to anybody you grant a license to for 12 months. And we've successfully achieved that on city buildings with grade A tenants and grade A landlords. And what that enables is you as a tenant to get out a 2-page license and say, this party's going to occupy my premises with me. It doesn't create the 3-year sublet alienation, but it does create a very short-term position that's very flexible and very controllable and not subject to consent.
I do like the idea of grading. I'm just wondering whether we should have grade A workplace consultants. Thanks for that, both. Rob,
yes,
what other questions do we have?
Well, if we just flip over to the tenant side, but still remaining on this idea of new leases, are tenants writing into new leases pandemic clauses that reduce payments in the future? That's sort of one angle of that question, and are landlords being sympathetic to that request? But also, are additional items being drawn into leases so that the terms can be renegotiated in a short period of time? For example, when there's more clarity over the pandemic and mandated working from home.
Intriguing. Okay, so on the contractual side, I want to go to Ramatu and Faye first. What are your experiences as to what's being written in contracts right now?
Yeah, do you want me to kick off, Faye, and then?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you. I think on the dealing with the second question first, which is, I suppose, flexible arrangements. I think that one's difficult, and I haven't come across that one yet. So, I mean, I guess there are situations in which people may actually enter premises on license or on short-term arrangements. So I suppose similar to what Lee and Richard were just talking about, but with a view to then entering into a lease later. But I think the difficulty is if you enter into a lease, it's fairly fixed in relation to its terms. And as far as the tenant's concerned, I'd be a bit concerned, without a break in there, about compromising the negotiating position in terms of negotiating better terms later. And there are all sorts of consequences in terms of stamp duty, land tax, and registration. So that I think certainly some of the clients I've been talking to would be concerned about committing to a lease on the basis that they would vary the terms later. In terms of pandemic clauses and rent reductions and that sort of thing, yeah, absolutely. People want those now. I think the initial experience that I've had, although I'll certainly pass over to Faye if she's had any other different experience, but the experience I've had on those is obviously tenants want them. Some landlords are being helpful and flexible. On the institutional landlord side, I think probably a little bit less so in terms of that being a clause which remains throughout the lease. But I think it kind of depends on how long the situation goes on for. But those sorts of clauses are certainly doing the rounds and are out there.
Not too surprising, I guess. Sorry, Faye.
I think from my perspective, obviously I deal with a lot of business tenancies, and we're having the situation where a tenant has a right to renew their lease, but they're choosing not to exercise that right at the moment, on the basis that they'd prefer to wait it out and see what happens in the future. Or they are choosing to exercise that right and just entering into a very short-term lease on the basis that they can then reassess the situation when things are a bit more clear.
Yeah, I understand it's back to that same issue of trying to get the shorter leases to provide as much flexibility as possible, I suppose, and that's going to be a landmark as we go into the future, I'm sure. Okay, great. Thanks, both of you. Rob, next question, please.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. It was more of a creative question around what tenants could be doing currently if they are in a sticky spot with regards to their lack of availability and useful space that they can't occupy, whether or not there's any creative solutions that anybody's come across.
What, with regard to their existing workspace, you mean?
Yeah, that's not a particularly well articulated question, I'm afraid, so I can give you another one if that would be better for me.
Well, I can certainly respond to the, obviously we would say that there's plenty that you can do. We're working with clients right now who are looking at how to make, shall we say, cost-effective changes whilst it's COVID secure, but then equally what can be created again cost effectively for the short term, whilst then beginning to plan a little bit more for the long term. So there are things that you can do now, but again, it's back to that preparation for the future, isn't it? That even if we think that there's a year or so before we might be into any degree of, and that's keeping fingers and toes crossed, but there's still work that can be done right now. Anyway, sorry, yes, move on to the next one.
Okay, fine, thank you. This question is related to co-working space. Previously, those models were looking slightly ropey, but for the future, are they the solution to handle hybrid working?
Well, that's an interesting one, isn't it? I guess a quick view over there from Liam. Richard, what are you seeing from occupiers? You were saying the take-up of serviced offices is potentially increasing. What are your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I think, obviously the explosion in growth of lots of different service offices in the UK over the last 5 years, proves that point. They've grown absolutely exponentially. Obviously, they're struggling at the moment, so there's much more vacancy. But I think long term, there is definitely a place for serviced offices. I think for a long time, historically, most people associated serviced offices with small companies. But that's totally changed. And, I think there was a point where, when WeWork was letting their space in central London, over 30% of all of the people going in were what they called enterprise clients. So clients with 500 staff in the UK. I think that generally speaking, there's definitely a place going forwards for them. I can't see large companies totally committing to service offices. I think it'll be a hybrid where we'll have a large leased office portfolio. And, there's important reasons for that. It's personalized, it's branded, it's controlled, and there's much more sort of flexibility in terms of what they can do with that space. But that being said, it absolutely makes sense for lots of businesses to have a small element that is in service offices that just allows them to flex in terms of headcount.
Indeed, I think the idea of having sort of the fixed, flexible and on-demand, which is a phrase that was being used even decades ago, is probably just becoming into the norm now. Well, thank you, everybody. Taking note of our time, I think we have to neatly draw ourselves to a close for this session. We hope that the conversation today has helped spark further conversations on the future of work and how we can draw together those key infrastructure aspects that enable us to do what we do, the physical, virtual and the human, in the way that we've been talking through them today. So firstly, can I pass on my very grateful thanks to our guest speakers today, Richard, Lee, Ramatu and Faye. So thank you very much. And our other panel members who have been available to answer questions as well. So we do thank you sincerely for that. And also grateful thanks to the wider Aberley team who were able to make sure that this could take place today. So please do join us for the final session of 3 on Thursday, the 3rd of December, where we take a closer look at the technology aspect this time and discussing how we create a frictionless experience, which I think is something with technology we'd all love to achieve, enabling teams to connect, collaborate, create, whilst maintaining that secure network to enable us all to work remotely with still that good provision of data access, security and sharing. And also that's going to be with Roger Wilkes, and great to be welcoming also Stefano Frotto, who's the Knowledge and Insights Lead at Microsoft. So please do join us then. In the meantime, many thanks for your time today, and have a great evening. Thanks, everybody, and goodbye.
Thanks, Tim.
Thanks,
Thank
Tim.
you.
Thanks, Tim.
Bye.
Thanks, Rob.
Bye.
Cheers all. Bye.